tonight, Israel's warning Tehran will burn if it wants all-out war, while Iran is refusing to surrender. The Supreme Leader says Israel's allies, including Britain, could now become a target. Both Israel and Iran say they're engaged in an existential conflict. 3 Israeli civilians have already been killed.
This is south of Tel Aviv. It's very much a civilian area, residential area, no sign of military installations anywhere around. I mean, the damage is immense.
Iranian state TV is reporting that at least 60 people have died in Tehran. Israel tells Sky News that was just the beginning.
We were at the 11th hour, and this is what we're trying to do, to remove this existential threat.
Benjamin Netanyahu is now calling for an uprising in Iran. We'll look at whether regime change is realistic under the iron fist of Ayatollah Khamenei. Plus, what will Britain do next, faced with threats against its military bases around the Middle East? Good evening from Amman in Jordan and this special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim. This entire region is on edge tonight over the prospect of all-out war, and it's not just the Middle East. Iran is also threatening to attack others, including the UK, if they come to Israel's defense. Jordan is located between the 2 warring nations, so for 2 days, missiles have been crossing the skies above my head in both directions. Firstly, Israel attacking Iran by targeting its top officials in the military and its nuclear scientists. And then Tehran reacting with fury, sending ballistic missiles into Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. On both sides, civilian casualties have been reported. The question tonight, where does this end? Both leaders want to bring down the other and say this is now an existential war. We'll look at the consequences for the region and the world. But first, our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, has tonight's first report from Israel.
Iran fired hundreds of ballistic missiles at Israel in 4 waves throughout Friday evening and into the early hours of Saturday. There were interceptions and explosions above Jerusalem, but Tel Aviv bore the brunt. One missile hit houses in a residential neighborhood south of the center. 2 people were killed here and dozens injured.
These houses took a direct hit from an Iranian ballistic missile last night. This is south of Tel Aviv. It's very much a civilian area, residential area, no sign of military installations anywhere around. I mean, the damage is immense. 2 people were killed and dozens wounded in this attack. And I mean, look at the blast radius is 40, 50 meters perhaps. Cars blown on top of each other, shrapnel in the walls of the houses, windows blown in, roofs completely destroyed. The Israeli defenses are very good, but they are not perfect. And this is what happens when a ballistic missile does hit.
Sivan grew up in this house. Her elderly parents were inside it when the missile struck.
She's got damages. All her face is like been damaged. Probably her nose has been broken. And my father, they're 75 years old, so they're 75 years old, so they're not healthy.
How do you feel looking at this?
Horrible. Terrible, horrible. All my life, and that's it.
Iran has also launched hundreds of drones at Israel. This was shot down near the Dead Sea this morning. And the Jordanian Air Force took out UAVs crossing its airspace. Israel has continued striking Iran without let-up. They have targeted nuclear sites and ballistic missile batteries. And the Israeli military says they now have opened up a path to Iran, giving them almost total freedom of operation over the capital, Tehran.
There's more to be done. So we're preparing. We paved the way to Tehran, and our pilots over the skies of Tehran will deal blows to the Ayatollah regime that they cannot even imagine. And I can tell you this, we have indications, that senior leaders in Iran are already packing their bags. They sense what's coming.
Israel has killed 9 senior Iranian nuclear scientists. Posters with their faces on have been put on billboards around Tehran with a vow to hit Israel back hard. Iran is expected to launch more missiles at Israel tonight. Its leadership is reportedly in some disarray, but still determined to keep fighting. At this moment, there is no talk of a ceasefire, and after 2 days of constant bombing, without much consequence, Israel will be reluctant to stop now.
Let's go straight to Ali, who joins us from Jerusalem. And Ali, just picking up from the end of your piece there, that Israel is going to continue to strike targets tonight. We're just getting a report that's coming in that Israel has allegedly struck a second Iranian gas facility in southern Iran. So as you say, these targets continue to be hit.
Yeah, in the last couple of hours, there's been reports, including video coming from western Iran, that Israel has hit a number of major gas facilities, including the South Pass gas facility, which I think provides something like 25% of Iran's gas, but also actually crucially, potentially, geopolitically, is shared with Qatar. But, you know, this would mark an escalation in Israel's attacks. It would represent a broadening of the scope of Israel's attacks against Iran to not just be against nuclear facilities, military facilities, and senior military personnel, but now parts of Iran's national infrastructure. So it is very significant indeed. And I'm also hearing reports that the port of Bandar Abbas is also under attack by a massive wave of strikes. Now, Bandar Abbas lies right on the coast of the Gulf near the Strait of Hormuz, and there is an analysis now that if Iran feels that it is somewhat curtailed in its ability to strike Israel back in retaliation, then another way of reacting is to cause massive disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a hugely important strait for a lot of the world's commercial and natural resource shipping. And that is what will concern a lot of Western countries in particular. So I think that all of that is pretty significant. Towards the end of my report, I was also saying that there is an expectation that Iran will continue further airstrikes against, or further ballistic missile strikes against Israel tonight. The reason that we anticipate them in the evening time is because during the daytime, the general assumption is that Iran will keep its ballistic missile batteries kind of somewhat hidden and use the cover of darkness in order to launch those attacks. It was about this time last night that the first ballistic missile wave came into Israel. It is quiet right now, but the night is still young, and so we will see what the night brings. But, it will be an indicator, potentially an indicator of basically what Iran has left in its locker, what it is able to do by way of retaliation against a massive, continuing, constant, unrelenting wave of airstrikes that the Israelis are carrying out, and now saying that they can operate, not without risk, but pretty carefree across Tehran, Iran's capital, which is deeply humiliating for the Iranian regime.
Indeed, and we will be getting an Iranian perspective a little later in the programme. Ali, thank you so much for that update. Well, Israel will count the assassinations of key military and scientific figures as major successes, but what remains unclear is how effective the strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities were. Satellite images confirm significant damage above ground. What's harder to ascertain is the damage done underground and at the heart of those nuclear facilities. Well, our Adam Parsons has been piecing together what we know so far. Let's just have a look.
Well, when Iran retaliated, it struck Israel with 4 waves of attacks, pretty much indiscriminately hitting Tel Aviv or nearby Rishon LeZion with missiles and with drones. Now, that is a contrast to the Israeli attack on Iran, which appears to have been much more precise and focused. So These are the places that we know to have been hit by Operation Rising Lion. In Kermanshah, which is just here, this missile base, where you can see, seems to have been blackened after it was hit. Actually, you can see some smoke rising on that image. Let's have a look at Tabriz. Now, this is a surface-to-air missile base. That's the photo before. Look at the buildings there, all intact. This is just one taken just after. You can see again, blackened, smoke rising, some of those buildings are damaged. Nuclear sites were also targeted. This one is in Fordow. That's actually a photo from March. The surface buildings at those nuclear sites were hit, but the main work at places like this goes on deep underground. It's unlikely the explosions would penetrate that far. You'd need American bunker busters. As for people in Tehran, the IDF claims that these are the precise spots in Iran's capital where it killed key military commanders. And if we change this map to these symbols, these each represent the killing of a nuclear scientist who was working on the weapons program, according to the Israelis. But all this military action has really got another aim, and that is to try to undermine Iran's leadership. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been in charge for nearly 36 years, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, hopes to spark regime change in the country. And that is why Israel has focused on trying to degrade the IRGC. That's an arm loyal to protecting the regime. And the operation has killed these military leaders. You could argue that that man, and that man, three hugely significant targets. It's going to have to do a lot more, though, to undermine the Tehran leadership. And that is very likely to mean a lot more attacks.
Adam Parsons reporting there. Well, let's get an Israeli perspective on what comes next. Joining me now is Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel. Thank you so much, Mr. Freilich, for joining us here on the programme. Do you believe that this was a risk worth taking for Benjamin Netanyahu? In the short term, it does appear that Israel has struck key infrastructure and exposed Iran's vulnerabilities. But could this tip the whole region into a new kind of war and cause mass casualties in Israel?
Well, I think people, when they talk about events like this, and the media like to take the worst case possibilities, which are possibilities. Nobody can say for sure that this will not expand into a significantly broader war. But I think that that's actually a low probability. What does a broader war mean? It means that the Iranians try and attack American bases in the region. That brings the United States in. They can try and attack the Arab states. That also brings the United States in. That's, I believe, totally counterproductive from an Iranian perspective, because they know what happens if the U.S. Gets involved, and they have enough difficulty with Israel. So I'm less concerned about.
I guess the question, Mr. Freilich, is how does this end? It's a question that General Petraeus often asks. You know, tell me how this ends.
Well, we're in the second day of the war, and again, the war has its own timetable. The media have a different timetable. This may last for a couple of weeks. And how it ends, I would imagine that the U.S. will have to play a major role. I think the objective is for it to end in a diplomatic agreement. And the real end game is to put pressure on the Iranians to agree to the kinds of concessions that they have refused to accept until now, to coerce them into doing it. That's, in one form or another, it will probably end in a diplomatic agreement.
If they do, though, continue their launching their ballistic missiles, is there a chance that perhaps Israel's air defenses are ultimately overwhelmed?
There is that possibility, but that's why Israel has spent much of the last few days focusing on their the ballistic missile capability. And of course, it hasn't, and it will not be reduced to zero, but it's been reduced significantly. And we'll have to see how it plays out. Hopefully, the possibility that you're talking about will not happen.
Yeah, I guess, would you then say a key factor of this is sort of the ballistic missiles that Iran could continue to launch on Israel, Israel needing the interceptors? The big question is, how much is the United States willing to step in and support Israel in that, while Israel continues to try and decapitate Iran's leadership, but also take out those ballistic missiles as quickly as possible?
Well, I think President Trump has demonstrated strong support in these last 2 days, and the U.S. has been involved in the defensive operations from the very beginning. So I don't think there's a question of whether the U.S. will help here. I think you have to put this whole thing in perspective. I mean, why is Israel doing this? And the answer is that this is really something which has been in the works for 30 years now. And we've had the Islamic Republic ever since it was established in 1979, repeatedly calling for Israel's destruction. Almost a day doesn't go by without it. And it's not just rhetoric. It's the nuclear program, it's the ballistic missile program, it's the vast sums that they invested in Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and others. It's the fact that we know that they were party to a pre-October 7th plan with Hamas. The war, October 7th, wasn't just about...
I understand that this has been an ambition of Benjamin Netanyahu's for decades, for 30 years. He's talked about this at every twist and turn. But the director for non-proliferation policy at the US-based Arms Control Association said Israel's prime minister did not present any clear or compelling evidence that Iran was on the brink of weaponizing. So why now?
Because so he decided that it wasn't a compelling case, and he may be right, but experts have been known to be wrong in the past, as have intelligence agencies. But there is information that the Iranians have renewed the weapons group in recent months, and they were taking measures to be able to reach an actual capability in a much shorter time frame. And this is viewed in Israel as an existential threat. I think most of the world agrees with Israel. Certainly, the leading Western countries have always agreed that it is an existential threat to Israel. And I think that's why we've seen the strong support from President Trump and President Macron and the Chancellor in Germany. And I regret that Britain has been less positive than they have.
But I guess the other question is this about Benjamin Netanyahu's survival as well? There were a 6th round of talks that were going to take place in Oman tomorrow. That's now not going to happen. And Benjamin Netanyahu has been under a lot of pressure over the way in which he's prosecuted the war in Gaza. So did he need this for his own survival and political capital?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And that is, of course, part of the picture. But the fact that there are political considerations here, there are always politics in all big decisions. But the fact that Netanyahu is fighting his own battle doesn't take away from the fact that Iran has presented a growing threat, an existential threat for decades. And I don't believe that any other state that faces this kind of threat would behave differently. So you can have two truths at the same time.
Chuck Freilich, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. Israel was able to limit the damage from last night's aerial attack by Tehran thanks to its air defense systems. But even those can be overwhelmed, as we discussed there in that interview, when the number of incoming missiles becomes impossible to contain. One of the key questions now is what Iran still has left in its arsenal and how that stacks up with Israel's. Our military analyst, Michael Clark, has been taking a look.
Israel and Iran have both been preparing for this confrontation for decades, so how do they stack up? Well, on paper, Iran far outnumbers Israel in terms of active and reserve personnel. Iran is a much bigger country than Israel, 86 million people to Israel's 10 million people. So the Iranians have got 960,000 personnel, Israel have got 634,000. But this war, of course, won't be about who has the more manpower. It's really about who has the best technology, particularly in the air war. And on that score, there is a clear and obvious winner. So let's look at the attack capabilities Now, first, Israel's weapon of choice. Of course, there are its fighter jets, the F-15, the S-16 and the F-35. Very stealthy, the F-35 can get through radar defences undetected. Very, very useful weapon system for the Israelis to operate. The Iranians, they operate much older Russian jets, and they've lost some of them. They don't work as well. And so instead, they've built up a huge stockpile of missiles and drones. And they include the Shahed 136 that we've seen much of in Ukraine, the Imad, the Khorram Shah, big missile, but this one, the Fatah. There's a whole family of Fatah missiles. They work. The most modern versions of them are thought to be hypersonic, which are really very difficult to defend against. In total, it's estimated that the Iranians may have 3,000 of these ballistic missiles. Most estimates would say it's probably nearer 2,000, but undoubtedly they have a lot of them, and they could keep throwing them at Israel over the coming days and weeks if they chose to do that. And Israel claims that Iran was building up the capacity to manufacture 300 ballistic missiles a month. And that, with their ranges, would put Israel and hundreds of US bases in the crosshairs around the region. So if you look at a range map, undoubtedly, the Iranians have a big capacity building in terms of their ballistic missiles and their drones. Now, over the years, Israel has the most advanced defense system in the world, and it's built it up. And it's getting support from United States assets in the region. And that system, most people call it the Iron Dome, but Iron Dome is only one type of missile. So there's the Iron Dome missile itself, there's David's Sling, which is a high-altitude, short-range, very fast missile, and there's the Arrow 3. Probably the best of the whole bit is the Arrow 3. That probably works the best of all. But between them, as well as with some Patriot missiles, they create this sense of a dome, a multi-layered dome that sits on top of their population centres that can cover the whole country, because it's a small country, and give them close to 100% protection. But, of course, no system will ever give you 100% protection. Now, you can see here, action over Tel Aviv. A few missiles did get through, but the vast majority were intercepted. But no system is ever 100%, because any system can be overwhelmed with sheer numbers. And in that respect, we know that Iran does have the numbers. But in contrast, Iran's air defences are older, they're weaker, and they've been badly hurt by Israel already. Now, the IDF have actually looked at some of these systems. The S-300, an old Russian system, doesn't work that well these days, if you know where it is. The Korad 15 and the Tactical Hunter. They're OK, but they're quite old. And the IDF has released these images of them attacking Iranian surface-to-air missiles near Tehran. And there they are. If they can spot them, they can destroy them. They've got enough intelligence to know where they are, even those which are mobile, like the S-300. Once they've spotted them, then effectively they're dead if the Israelis decide to go for them. Finally, Israel has the one thing that they don't want Iran to have: nuclear weapons. The Jericho 2, which is a nuclear weapon-tipped missile. The Israelis will never confirm or deny whether they have nuclear weapons, and they deny that they are running a nuclear program in this way, but we all know that they are. They have the Jericho 2, it is nuclear. The Iranians would love to have what the Israelis have had for years. And in response to these attacks, the Iranians talk a very good game. They talk big, and they can certainly hurt Israel. But in a war of the skies, which this is going to be for some time yet, Tel Aviv certainly has the upper hand.
As Professor Michael Clark there, you're watching a special programme on the Israel-Iran attacks with me, Yalda Hakim. Coming up on the programme, is Britain ready for the possibility of an attack on its military bases in the Middle East? We'll evaluate Tehran's threat to the UK. Welcome back to this special edition of The World. Iran has threatened to strike military bases belonging to the likes of the UK, the United States, around the Middle East, if they help Israel repel attacks from Tehran. Despite that, tonight the Prime Minister said he would be moving assets, including jets, into the region. Well, Britain has air bases in the likes of Qatar, the United Arab Emirates and Oman. The Navy has a presence in Bahrain and Oman, while RAF, Navy and Army personnel are all stationed at 2 bases in Cyprus, in Akrotiri and Dhekelia. Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Nick Martin, who joins us now. And Nick, we've heard from the Prime Minister tonight, and of course the Iranians have directly threatened the UK and its bases if the UK makes any sorts of moves. But we have started to hear and see that the United Kingdom is starting to make those plans by moving some military assets to the region.
That's right, Yalda. We are told by the Prime Minister that at some point yesterday, pilots were told to prepare their jets to move to the Middle East. It's likely that that decision was probably made during yesterday's Cobra Emergency Committee meeting, which was chaired by the Prime Minister and involved some senior ministers and senior military figures. And it's likely that those jets are now heading to various bases in the Middle East, likely to be one or nearly all of the ones that you've just outlined. But having said that, the Prime Minister is also being very careful with the language that he uses. He has, for the last day, been talking a lot about de-escalation and diplomacy. We've been hearing that time and time again, and reiterating the fact that the UK is not involved in this operation. But at the same time, he's told reporters that the decision to send jets to the Middle East is a precaution, is in response to rising tensions. This is what he said to reporters. He said these are obviously operational decisions and that the situation is ongoing and developing, and therefore I'm not going to get into the precise details, but we are moving assets, he means jets. We've already been moving assets to the region, including jets, and that is for contingency support across the region. So that's happening. But he will have in the back of his mind those threats made by Iran towards the UK, France and the United States, that if we intervene in firing down missiles or drones, then Iran will attack our assets too. But it's no surprise, really, that the Prime Minister has made the decision to send things like jets to the Middle East, given the escalation in tensions.
Yeah, absolutely. No surprises. Nick, thank you so much. The Prime Minister then faces a dilemma over how to respond to Tehran's threats and serious consequences if the UK helps defend its ally, Israel. Well, joining me now is Britain's former ambassador to Iran, Rob McCare. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. You were based out of Iran. You've spent time there. You have worked with the Iranians. You've spent time talking to them. Just tell me how they'd be reacting to the escalation over the course of the last 48 hours.
Well, yes, I think if you put yourself in the position, you put themselves in the shoes of the decision makers in Tehran, they are in an incredibly difficult position, aren't they? Because Israel has a very, very capable attack force, as your report has just been outlining, and Iran's options are pretty limited. Now, they have always been, they've always shown themselves able to be tactically nimble when they need to be, but the big question out there, which everyone's trying to work out, and none of us know where this is going to go, is whether the leadership in Tehran decide they're going to broaden this by attacking regional countries or US bases or even other Western bases in the region, or broaden it by attacking shipping. But of course, the other really big threat, the longer term threat, is that they decide to respond to this attack on their nuclear program by vowing to accelerate it and to rebuild it and to go for a weapon directly, which is what they've always said they would do under attack. So that is the real long term threat, and then the West faces the question of how to deal with that again. And is this going to be a recurring scenario, or can we get to a negotiated agreement?
Were you surprised by the fact that Iran was taken by surprise? I mean, it very much feels like everyone was aware that this strike, these series of strikes was likely to happen, except the regime.
Well, I mean, people in the West have been saying to Iran for years that if their nuclear program continues recklessly and unrestrained, and there's no diplomatic agreement to put it under very tight control, then ultimately they're likely to face military attack, either from Israel or the US or both. That's not a secret. It hasn't been a secret. But I guess that they would have thought that since talks were ongoing with the US, that they would probably be safe while that was happening.
There's calls now coming from Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli leadership calling for regime change. I mean, the regime is deeply unpopular. We have seen uprisings in Iran, but is that likely to happen? I mean, this is a regime that's existed since 1979, and they do have an iron fist hold over their population. Is it, any chance that, given these airstrikes, that could tip the regime over the edge?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Yalda. It's so difficult to see it happening. I mean, no one ever successfully predicts revolutions, even the people who end up taking part in them. But the regime's really unpopular. And certainly when I was living there, I was amazed how many people would very freely talk about how much they hated the regime. But they tended to say that a chaos and a revolution and a civil war would be worse. So I'm not sure that Iran is really in a pre-revolutionary state, or that the idea that these military attacks could tip it over into that sort of regime change. It seems to be quite a big gamble on the part of Israel. It doesn't seem to be very likely. There have, as you say, been lots and lots of protests. The regime is incredibly unpopular. It has lost its legitimacy with the vast majority of the people. But it also has the ability to put force on the streets and to kill a lot of people if it needs to. And I think that's the situation that they're in. But it's very unpredictable with this, particularly with these the assassinations of the leading officials and military figures. It's very difficult to see where it goes.
Yeah, I'm interested and curious by what you've said in terms of, people openly talk about not liking the regime, wanting them gone, but at the same time feeling like civil war and any kind of conflict would be far worse. I mean, you yourself have felt, the pressure of the regime. You were detained when you were in Iran for attending one of the protests. There have been attempts in the past, even in the last few years, to speak up against this regime, and they seem to just either throw people in prisons, execute them, or round them up off the streets.
Yes, that's absolutely right, and it's a very brutal regime, and they know that they can make an example of some people. A lot of people have been very courageous in protesting against the regime, in particularly in the hijab demonstrations a couple of years ago. But even recently, there's been a big truck driver strike. There's constant undercurrents of discontent in the country, not least because of the economic situation, and people do come out on the streets, they do protest, and the regime knows it's unpopular, but it's an unequal contest when it comes to displaying force on the streets. So, as I say, I think it would be brave to predict what's going to happen in this really unstable situation and what's going to happen domestically, but it's for the people of Iran to decide that, not people outside the country.
Ambassador, really grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Watching a special program on the Israel-Iran attacks with me, Yalda Hakim, coming up on the program. What damage was done to Iran's nuclear facilities? We'll be live in Tehran and speak to a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. Welcome back to the programme. Speaking to Sky News today, a spokesperson for Israel's foreign ministry gave his justification for Israel's attacks. Omer Marmorstein said Iran's progress towards creating a nuclear bomb had pushed Israel to the 11th hour. He also said his military had no plans to stop bombing Iran. Have a listen.
So the first round of activity of the operation was very successful. Nuclear sites were severely damaged, and all the weapon scientists, all the generals were involved in trying to get Iran to this point of no return, were also severely damaged. So I think we can look at a very successful point of operation. It's not done. We have still work to do, because the scale, just to give you an idea, the Iranian regime was trying to get itself with a capability of producing 300 missiles, ballistic missiles, a month. This is something that for a tiny country like Israel could be catastrophic.
A spokesperson of Israel's foreign ministry, Benjamin Netanyahu, has named this assault on Iran as Operation Rising Lion and called on Iranians to rise up in a revolt against the supreme leader. Well, let's bring in Professor Saeed Mohammed Morandi, a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. Professor Morandi, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Did Iran majorly miscalculate? Because even now, President Trump is providing Iran with an off-ramp, telling them to come to the negotiating table. At what point will Iran take that offer?
Well, according to your narrative, Iran always miscalculates. It's a regime. I heard the regime 20 times in the last 10 minutes as I was listening. You sound like TASS news agency upgraded during the Soviet Union. And you say the regime is unpopular and is killing its people. When General Soleimani was murdered by the same Trump that you talk about, millions of people came to the streets of this city, Tehran, that I'm in. So how is it that he's so unpopular? This propaganda that you're producing is only justifying aggression. What the Israeli regime did was aggression. What it did was unjustified aggression. And Netanyahu has been saying for over 30 years, some say up to 40 years, he's been saying that Iran's on the verge of creating a nuclear weapon. And thanks to people like you, he gets away with these lies. But people can go online and check how many times he said
Professor Morandi, if you could just focus on, I know your narrative and I know the line you take, and we've spoken a number of times, and I'm sure, but if you could just focus on answering the question, in terms of the nuclear talks, on day 60, as far as we know, Donald Trump had said Iran has 60 days. Israel attacked on the 61st day. Can we talk a little bit about the regime's competence levels, the intelligence and security, the competence of your intelligence and security agencies, the fact that Mossad was able to build drone sites in your country, the fact that the leadership was asleep in their beds when they were struck and that you ignored these warnings. Can we talk a little bit about the fact that the regime was taken completely by surprise and top leaders have now been decapitated and killed as a result of the Israeli attack?
Saying regime, I think it helps you contain your contempt for independent countries. You after all, you work for Sky News. It's understandable. But the regime, how do you know that the Israeli regime had bases inside Iran? You're just repeating their propaganda. Of course, Israel for you is not a regime. Sorry, it's a state. But it's a genocidal state carrying out extermination in Gaza. But that's not really important. But how do you know
so are that you denying that the top commanders are being killed? Are you denying that top commanders were killed?
Oh, so you mean what you're referring to basically is an attack, an act of aggression, that they suddenly fire missiles at civilian targets at apartment buildings and slaughter people in those apartment buildings, slaughtering whole families. For you, that's targeting. That's a really sophisticated act.
But if I can just ask, have military facilities been hit? Have nuclear facilities been hit?
one of the buildings that had some of these commanders, one or two of these commanders, was a large apartment building where they killed everyone, 60 people, 20 children. That's not important for people like you, but that's important for people like us. For you, people like you who support ethno-supremacism and the chosen people being able to slaughter and exterminate
Professor
Palestinians.
Morandi, I'm just trying to get the perspective. We're trying to give you airtime so that you can give us the Iranian perspective on this. And we want to know, and I want to understand, Iran's position here. Will you come to the negotiating table now? Donald Trump, after these series of airstrikes and this attack was launched, called on Iran to come back to the negotiating table. As the spokesperson of the regime, or, you know, as someone who worked closely with the negotiating team, do you believe they will come to the negotiating table now?
Well, your regime should know, and your news agency or your TV channel should know better. We were at the negotiating table. It was Trump that conspired with Netanyahu to attack Iran. This is how you twist the truth. You shouldn't invite me because you're easily exposed. Iran was negotiating. Initially, Trump had one position, and so did Witkoff. And then they flipped and said no enrichment. And then they continued the negotiations. And the night before the attack, Trump said that we don't want war. And then after the attack, he said, we're all for it. And you're saying Iran? Is Iran going to come back to the negotiating table? The audacity. Come on, show at least a bit of integrity. A bit of integrity will help.
Okay, Professor Morandi, thanks again for joining us here on the program. I just want to bring you some breaking news and move away from the Israel-Iran story for a moment. We know that the authorities have been searching for a man who shot and killed a Minnesota lawmaker and her husband in what has been described as a brazen attack at their home early on Saturday. And a second lawmaker and his wife were wounded in a separate shooting in what has been described as a targeted political violence. Just via our sister channel, NBC, those people familiar with the investigation now say that the police are looking for a 57-year-old man from Minnesota. His name is Vance Bolter, and he's the person police are looking for in connection with the shooting of the state lawmakers. When we get more information for you, we will be bringing it to you. But these images are of the police, and that search does continue for Vance Bolter, who's named as the suspect in the Minnesota shooting of those two lawmakers. Now, the United States has already played a central role in this conflict. American Patriot missile defense systems were used, as well as a Navy destroyer, to shoot down ballistic missiles targeted at Israel. The country has a major presence within the Middle East, with bases in places like Qatar, Kuwait and Iraq. Iran may soon consider those bases a target after that threat to attack those who defend Israel. Well, let's bring in our US correspondent, Mark Stone. And Mark, a lot of developments over the course of the last 48 hours. I just want to ask you about these threats coming from the Iranians that, as they've said in the past, that if the Americans, the Brits, are seen to get involved, they will be fair game too when it comes to Iran's retaliation.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it is alarming, but it is something that the Brits, the French and the Americans were fully expecting would happen as a consequence of what we've seen unfold over the course of the past, 36 hours. I mean, the Americans have a massive military and diplomatic presence across the Middle East, 40,000 troops at the last public count. The last time the Americans publicly disclosed the numbers there was back in October last year, 40,000 across the Middle East. You can see them there, and you can see quite clearly how they are. Many of them will be within range of Iranian weapons. We know that they will be on their highest state of alert. We know that diplomatic missions were already told prior to this attack, which gives you some sense that Trump clearly knew what was coming, that the non-essential staff had been removed from diplomatic missions. But those air bases are now at threat, and we've seen them being hit before. Remember, it was, I think, 2020 when then Donald Trump, in his first term, took out the head of the Revolutionary Guard of Iran, Soleimani, in a drone strike when he was visiting Iraq. That prompted the Iranians back then to carry out retaliatory strikes against the Al-Assad air base and a large American air base in Iraq. That was the death by the Americans, or the killing by the Americans, of just one senior Iranian official. What happened over the course of the past 36 hours is a whole host of different people, including the successor to General Soleimani. So, albeit by the Israelis, but the fact that the Iranians have now said that effectively British, French, and American assets, to use the jargon, are effectively fair game is clearly of concern. The question is, strategically, what would they decide to do? I mean, the biggest airbase, American airbase in the Middle East, is in Qatar. It is, in fact, a place that Donald Trump visited just a few weeks ago. But for the Iranians to hit that, well, that would be hitting Qatari soil. That would be a game changer in terms of their decision making. Hitting air bases in places like Iraq, well, that would be kind of diplomatically easier for them to do, because Iraq is largely, is to a great extent aligned with Iran anyway, so they could perhaps get clearance from the Iraqis to do something specifically on an American airbase in Iraq, but you can see that you can see how all this would spiral, Yalda, very, very quickly. If the Iranians were to decide to hit an American airbase and were to be successful in killing American troops, well then, game changer, complete game changer.
Yeah, and Mark, I mean, just briefly, while we are seeing the Israelis escalate the situation and continue to hit targets even in the last hour or so, there is an attempt to de-escalate. We heard Vladimir Putin spoke with Donald Trump and said that, Russia could potentially act as some kind of mediator in this as well, and that he had spoken to both the Iranian leadership as well as the Israelis.
Yeah, I mean, remember that the Russians are very close to Iran, and I suppose there is, in this argument or this discussion that everyone's been having about what the ultimate goal here is it regime change in Iran? What will the Iranian leadership decide to do? We just don't know, but they do have real allies in both China, who are buying a huge amount of Iranian oil, and Russia, who are buying a lot of Iranian equipment to help them with their war in Ukraine. So they have allies there. There is no question about that. And so that is clearly a calculation on the American president's mind. But for me, Yalda, the big surprise in all this is the fact that Donald Trump has pretty much said nothing. I mean, there have been a couple of social media posts earlier on, straight after the Israeli attacks, not the Iranian retaliations, which were kind of intentionally ambiguous, I think. I mean, we know that he has said publicly last week he didn't want Israel to do this. Now these posts seem to suggest a degree of ambiguity, and then subsequently he said, well, actually, I do think maybe that the Israeli strikes make negotiations more plausible, not less plausible. Many regional analysts have disagreed with that, but we haven't heard from him. No public statement from the American president. Instead, he is going to be celebrating his birthday tonight, also the birthday of the US military, US Army, I should say, with a massive military parade here in Washington that's going to get going later on this evening. That is his focus. He, talks a lot about peace through strength. Peace through strength will be demonstrated tonight at his birthday party, which he says is a coincidence, the birthday party of the US Army. But no public word from him yet. He is due to speak tonight at this event, and so I imagine he will make reference to this. But I think people are kind of curious to find out quite what he thinks. Was he undermined by the Israeli Prime Minister, or did he give if not a green light, an amber light to what unfolded yesterday?
Yeah, feels a little bit mixed messages at times. Mark, thank you so much. Well, let's assess the options on the table for President Donald Trump. As Mark was saying, joining me now is Simone Leiden, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for the Middle East under President Trump. Simone, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Just hearing there from my colleague, Mark Stone from Washington, who talked about the fact that we haven't sort of heard a lot from President Trump in the last 36 hours. A couple of posts on Truth Social, a couple of statements, but no clear sort of indication of US strategy and positioning. Just your thoughts on what's transpired over the course of the last 36 hours.
Well, I think the fact that he hasn't issued a statement other than answering a few press questions here and there in the last few days, I believe that speaks for itself. President Trump has offered the Iranian regime a chance, as you noted yourself, multiple times to come back to negotiations. He was trying to avoid this situation, this war, but the Iranian regime was intent on moving forward with its nuclear and ballistic missiles programs, which now, thanks to the Israelis, have been at least delayed for several years, if not more. But he has left the door open for future talks. But it'll be interesting to see now, with a lot of the Iranian regime's leadership and the previous negotiators dead, who would be coming back, or who would be coming to negotiate, number one. And number two, the Iranian position is obviously completely different than it was a few days ago. They're greatly reduced. So they don't have the leverage that they used to have.
Yeah, and I guess it's also how long both sides can sustain this. The Israelis say they will go on for as long as it needs to decapitate and dismantle Iran's program and leadership. But on the other hand, you know, can Iran continue to launch ballistic missiles? And is Israel in a position to be able to intercept them? Will their air defenses be overwhelmed? And at that point, will the United States step in?
Well, those are all very good questions. On the Iranian side, there are various estimates I've seen regarding the number of ballistic missiles that they have remaining in their stores, given the sustained attacks that the Israelis have been undertaking in this operation. How many more nights can they do this? And exactly right. How effective will the Israeli defenses be at defending against them? We've seen mostly great success on the Israeli side. Certainly, they have an air defense system, a very robust one, as compared to the Iranian regime, whose air defenses have been completely annihilated at this point. But some of the weapons that they're using for air defense need to be, at some point, they'll need to be replenished. And so I wouldn't discuss here, obviously, what that looks like, but that's just the reality of some of these systems. They need to be replenished. So I know Israel has a variety of capabilities. They're one of the best in the world at this, and we've obviously supplemented them significantly. But that is a question the longer this goes on.
Absolutely. Simone, really grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for this special program focused on the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. The two countries say this is now existential. So what's the end game? We'll be following all the developments. Stay with us on Sky News. Good night for now.